Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new to my channel, hello, my name is Gabby and welcome. If you've never been here before, never watched any of my videos, have no idea what I do here on my channel, I cover true crime cases, and all the cases that I cover are a little bit older. They're all basically 20 years or older, so if that's something that you might be interested in, maybe go down below, click that subscribe button, and also make sure to turn on the post notifications to be notified every time that I upload. So today I have another unsolved murder case for you all, and this one happened all the way back in 1954, so it's been unsolved for 67 years. But before we get into the case, I do have to say that today's video, we have a sponsor, which I'm really excited about. This video is sponsored by Babbel. Take it away, sponsorship Gabby from a few days ago. Babbel is a language learning app that has been proven to get you speaking your desired language in just 3 weeks with its award-winning technology. Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers and offers you multiple ways to learn your new language, from simple lessons to podcasts to games to videos to live classes with top teachers. Babbel is designed to teach you real-life communication with its short 10-minute lessons, and if you decide Babbel isn't for you, you have a 20-day money-back guarantee. Now, the reason I picked up Babbel and wanted to work with them is that I was the girl in high school that nearly flunked out of my language class. I have been convinced my entire life that my brain literally has a language blocker for learning new languages. Babbel is the only service though that I have tried that has helped me organically learn a new language. I'm still a beginner, but I chose French, and my main reasoning for choosing French is because France was my grandmother's favorite place, and I will go someday. I will visit the country, and I refuse to go not knowing some of their language. Babbel though has so many languages you can choose from. After French, I will probably go with Italian because I'm Italian myself.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Ça va?
Ça va. Well, if you want to start picking up a new language in just 3 weeks, Babbel is offering up to 65% off their service for my subscribers who click the link in the description of today's video. So go check them out. Thank you, Babbel, for sponsoring today's video, and let's get right into the case. This is the unsolved murder of Carolyn Wasilewski. Carolyn Loretta Wasilewski was born on June 12th of 1940 in Baltimore City, Maryland, to parents Stanley and Mary Wasilewski. In the year 1954, she was 14 years old, attending Southern High School in Baltimore as a freshman. She came from a loving family that resided at 3121 Mardell Avenue. She was the oldest of 7 children. There was her 12-year-old sister Bonita, her 9-year-old brother Stanley, her 7-year-old sister Charlotte, her other 7-year-old sister Linda, her 6-year-old sister Tinia, and her 3-year-old sister Jackie. Now, the family's last name in English, it looks like it would be pronounced Wasilewski, but it is a Polish last name and it is pronounced Wasilewski. I did a little bit of research on how to pronounce it. But the family back then, they did know that it was a little hard to pronounce, so they would often go by an ulterior last name, which was Wells. So if you were to dive into this case and look at old newspaper articles like I did, I mostly use newspapers.com, a lot of the times they called the family the Wells family. But for this video, I am going to be referring to them as the Wasilewski family. Carolyn was a blonde-haired beauty who was known as being quite mature for her age. Most thought she was in her early 20s rather than a young teenager. Her friends called her Peaches. That year in school, she was studying typing, English, science, math, music, art, and junior business training. It was said by her teacher that she seemed interested in becoming a good business student, although her grades were not much better than average. Carolyn and her mother, Mary, were very close to each other. They liked to do things like bowl and skate together, but Carolyn, when it came to her on her own, her favorite things in the entire world were singing and dancing. Carolyn actually used to sing in her church choir, and when it came to dancing, she loved to go out for a night of dancing, but of course she was 14 years old, so it was when her parents allowed her. She was described by one of her teachers as being a pleasant girl and always courteous. Her friend Harriet said she always got along well with other girls and was a very jolly companion. Carolyn, like I said, was mature for her age, and she was definitely known as being a rebel. This was one thing that people who knew her knew about her. If you asked people, how would you describe Carolyn? They would say, you know, she's a sweet girl, but she's a little bit of a rebel. Carolyn would find herself involved with a group of individuals who called themselves Drapes. They were the Drapes. They were basically a gang that committed petty crimes around the area. Think the greaser type. When I say petty crimes, think auto theft and disturbing the peace in public places. Those sort of things. This group was also known for hosting a lot of illegal hot rod races, and these hot rod races usually took place really late at night. They always dressed in black leather jackets, no matter how hot it was outside, denim pants, slick backed hair, had a comb in the pocket, and always smoking a cigarette. This is the crowd that Carolyn spent most of her time hanging around, and obviously her parents grew quite concerned. They didn't want their really young teenage daughter hanging out with an older group of people who partook in things like drinking and sex. They just feared that Carolyn was going down a wrong path in life and she was being exposed to things far too early. A year before this case took place, when Carolyn was 13, her parents decided to send her to the House of the Good Shepherd, which was a non-profit reformatory institution in Baltimore for adolescents ages 13 to 21 who, as they saw it, were suffering from severe emotional and behavioral problems. They opened their doors in 1864, and they believed that no child was a lost cause. They tried their hardest to steer everyone who walked through their doors on a right path. That year before, when she was 13, she spent about 3 weeks at the House of the Good Shepherd, and her mother really thought that this had straightened her out. Going there though, it didn't really change Carolyn's life too much. It seemed that she still hung out with the same crowd, but this time she was a bit more secretive about it. The date in discussion is Monday, November 8th of 1954. And on this day, Carolyn told her parents that she was heading to her friend Peggy Lamanna's home on Washington Boulevard because they were going to go to Morrell Elementary School and register for the new winter dance program. Peggy was 16 years old, and this was the friend that Carolyn did most everything with. They were always together. Now, Carolyn did love to dance, and it was said her favorite dance was doing the dragnet, which was kind of a form of the jitterbug. Her parents, though, figured this was just a cover-up for whatever she was actually going to be doing that night. Her parents didn't argue with her on it. Carolyn was going to do what she planned to do, and she left the family home at 6:15 p.m. wearing a black jacket, a pink sweater, a pink and black patterned skirt, moccasins, a black scarf around her neck, a green scarf around her head, and her hair was in curlers. Carolyn never arrived at Peggy's home though, and chances are she never intended to. When hours had passed, her parents grew worried for their daughter. It was like her to stay out later than intended, but it was a Monday night. It would be a little bit different if it was, say, a Friday or Saturday night. Her parents went out looking for her that Monday night. They drove around the area and they located Peggy, who was standing with her friend, Phyllis. Peggy stated that she had waited for Carolyn, but Carolyn never showed, so she went to the school and registered on her own. This was 1954, so this was during the Cold War, and at this time, standard signals were being used throughout the country for civil defense purposes, referred to as alert and attack. At the beginning of 1952, the Bell and Lights air raid warning system made by AT&T was made available all over the United States, and there were 4 main warnings, each one with a color. Red was an imminent attack, yellow was a likely attack, white was all clear, and blue was high-low, which was a specific local warning to that area. They knew that on this date, there was going to be a red test siren going off, and coincidentally, the siren went off right when Carolyn's parents were speaking to Peggy about Carolyn. The 2 girls went inside the nearest building during the drill, and Mr. and Mrs. Wasilewski stayed in the car. When the signal was over, they drove home. They searched all night, and there was no trace of her anywhere. Police, though, they were not phoned that night. Her parents were honestly hoping that she would show up sometime later on. Her parents, though, they were pretty much restless the entire night. Mary even telling her husband, "If I knew she was all right, I'd be all right, but she might be lying dead along the road or something." While her parents were still in a panic that next morning over their daughter, a ghastly discovery was made a little after 7 a.m. A train engineer that was passing from Harrisburg to Baltimore slowed the train down to switch tracks. As he was doing this, he saw something ahead laying on the tracks and knew immediately what it was. it was a body. The train slowed down and no one knew what the hell was going on, said passenger Bill Stump, a writer for the Sunday Sun magazine in the year of 1954. The train engineer stopped the train just in time before he would have ran over the body on the tracks. Police were called to the scene immediately. The body, it was obvious that it was of a girl, and at first, police were unsure of who she was due to there being no identification on her, but they guessed that she may have been around 20 years old. According to the Baltimore Sun, which was the main paper who covered this case back in the day, they said long before she was identified, police had concluded that the murder had occurred elsewhere and she had been thrown from the bridge or dragged down a bank to the tracks. They did find some blood on the railing above the tracks. Police believed the intention of the killer was to make sure she ended up on the tracks, so she would be ultimately ran over by an oncoming train. The Pensy local train that morning was supposed to come over that exact spot at about 7:17 a.m. If the train engineer didn't stop the train in time, her killer or killers would have gotten their wish. The last train the night before came through the area at about 10:30 p.m. and her time of death was estimated based on her autopsy to be about 11 p.m. So due to that, we know that she hadn't been run over by a train at any time. But her body was in horrendous condition, almost like it had been. She was partially naked, laying face down. Her shoes and skirt were missing. Although she was naked, it wasn't believed that she had been raped. She was completely covered in bruises and scratches. She suffered a broken jaw and broken ribs. She had a broken finger. It was believed that this broken finger had come from her trying to fight off her killer or killers the night before. Lastly, one of the strangest aspects of her body was that she had something written on her right thigh. It was the name Paul written in lipstick. Based on her remains, whoever did this to her probably worked pretty fast and definitely worked sloppy. This Jane Doe, though, would be positively identified the next day as being the missing girl, Carolyn Wasilewski, by her father, Stanley. Her mother, Mary, fell to her knees when she found out Carolyn was in fact the girl found on the train tracks earlier that day. We're going to backtrack just a tiny bit. The morning after Carolyn went missing from her home, her mother, Mary, actually went to Carolyn's school. A classmate of Carolyn stated that Carolyn's mother entered their typing class and told the teacher and the entire class that Carolyn had possibly run away and she was maybe hitchhiking, and if she was hitchhiking and run away, she definitely had no money on her. It would be later that day when her mother heard about the body being found. She didn't think at first that it was her daughter Carolyn because police thought the girl was around 20 years old. But as soon as she heard about the name Paul being written in lipstick on the girl's thigh, she knew that it was most likely her daughter. Her husband got home from work a little bit later. They talked about it and he went to the department and identified the body at around 7 that night. The autopsy concluded that Carolyn's cause of death was a fracture to her skull. Authorities did not believe that the crime scene was anywhere near the train tracks. There just wasn't any evidence really pointing to that. It wouldn't take them very long at all, though, to find the actual crime scene. About 8 miles from the place she was found, not far from her home, in a vacant lot near the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Mount Winans yard, authorities located bloodstains and some of Carolyn's belongings. According to a newspaper article, at this location they found gold pendant earrings, 2 sides of a matching locket, a locket chain, an aluminum hair curler, and her moccasins. To this day, they have still never located her skirt or jacket. This site is where they believe that Carolyn had taken her final breath. Police started their questioning, and one of the first things that they really learned was that the night of the murder, not long after her time of death, there had been a light-colored vehicle with a dark top seen on the bridge above the railroad tracks. As a Baltimore County firefighter drove closer to the bridge, the car on it sped off, even running a red light in the process of leaving the area. The firefighter who witnessed this stated that this happened about 11:40 p.m. Could this have been Carolyn's killer? A lot of people think so. Of course, the firefighter, he didn't know that this girl's body was laying down on the train tracks, so he didn't really think much of it. I mean, he thought it was odd, but at the time, he just didn't know. I'm sure if he knew that this girl's body was laying down on the train tracks, he would have sped after the car. Carolyn's funeral was held on November 12th at St. Peter the Apostle Roman Catholic Church with her girlfriends as her pallbearers. She was buried in Holy Redeemer Cemetery near the grave of her grandfather. The Baltimore Sun wrote about the occasion. Although Carolyn had gained a reputation for living beyond her tender years, the last rites were those for a little girl. During the initial investigation, over 300 individuals were questioned by Baltimore police. This included family members, friends, members of the Drapes, everyone you could think of who was connected to Carolyn in any way. Her family grieved over the loss of their beloved Carolyn, but they had to stay strong to help in the investigation to find out what monster or monsters did this to her. Her parents did agree to take a polygraph test at the time, and this was actually one of the first times a polygraph test was being used in a case in this manner in Baltimore so far. Now, the first thing I want to go over is Paul, the name that was written on her thigh in lipstick. Who was Paul? Well, Paul is believed to be a 20-year-old that Carolyn was romantically involved with. He had committed grand larceny and breaking and entering and was in reform school because of this. Carolyn and Paul had been kind of romantically involved with each other, but they were not official. She was a little bit infatuated with him though, even carrying a photo of him in her purse. This photo was one taken of him while he was puffing on a cigarette, and it had a note on it that said, "Paul's a real gone kid, sweet little thing." Carolyn definitely really liked Paul, and she even wrote him daily. Since Paul was put away at the time of Carolyn's murder, it was not believed he had any involvement, and Paul was actually pretty helpful when it came to the investigation. Paul would give police an entire list of people that both him and Carolyn knew. Paul believed maybe it was someone who wanted to pin the murder on him or had some sort of jealousy over their connection. None of the people Paul gave police to look into, though, ever turned into solid suspects. As for sightings of Carolyn the night that she was killed, one of the first ones came from a blacksmith named Kenneth Wheeler. He claimed that he spotted Carolyn with another girl walking down Washington Boulevard toward Hammond's Ferry Road. Then he later spotted the two girls at a cafe on Washington Boulevard at about 8:50 p.m. that Monday night. He said that the girls were in a back booth in the cafe, smoking cigarettes and carrying on. Mr. Wheeler said he did not know of the girl before, but after he saw her photo in the local newspaper, he knew her as the girl that he saw that day at the cafe and walking along the street. This supposed sighting of her, though, could not be supported by anyone else. No one else had claimed that they saw her in the cafe that day. Was she actually at this cafe with a friend? We don't know. From my knowledge, none of her friends came forward claiming they were at the cafe with her that Monday that she was killed. This could be due to them being afraid to be considered a suspect. That's possible. Of course, though, people really looked at the group that she hung around with. The Drapes were known for causing a lot of frustration for people in the area, but none of their crimes ever included murder. The coverage of the case in the media caused a frenzy when it came to this group. Had the local gang upped their antics and took it too far this time? That is truly what a lot of people believed. Even the Baltimore Sun quoted Carolyn's father during an episode of Irritation where he said that Carolyn just wouldn't listen when it came to this group and she brought it on herself. Her parents had been so fed up over the fact that Carolyn just would not stay away from this group. Like I stated before, members of the Drapes had been questioned intensely, and a few of them did end up sticking out to police. One of those being a 22-year-old man named Rocky. It was actually said that he had been on a date with Carolyn the night that she was murdered. This Rocky fella was someone who was brought up during questioning by other people a few times. Apparently at first, police had a pretty hard time even tracking him down. According to a newspaper article released on November 28th of 1954, Rocky had been located at 3 a.m. by police in late November at Eastern Avenue and Conkling Street in Highlandtown. He was held at the Eastern Police Station for a few hours of questioning and then transferred to headquarters for interrogation by the homicide squad. So this was pretty intense, and it's understandable why. Pretty much as soon as police heard that Carolyn had supposedly been out that night before with a member of the Drapes, they needed to hear what he had to say. The captain of detectives, George H. Minchins, had described Rocky as one of a number of persons we have been wanting to talk to who may know something about the case. They regarded him as someone they were questioning, not an actual suspect. After questioning him, police didn't think he was a solid suspect in her case and let him go, keeping him though on the sidelines to possibly question in the future. According to a newspaper article that I found, Rocky was said to have tore apart the story about him being on a date with her. So I'm thinking that he basically said that that was made up, that it was just a rumor, and that he hadn't actually seen her. Information regarding Rocky is very limited, and I really couldn't find much information online about what he actually said happened the night that she had been brutally murdered. Whatever he said though made him look like he didn't have anything to do with it. Police were urged, mostly by the public, to look into more of the drapes. They ended up questioning a total of 13 of them, and this 13 included a man named Joe, who was a 23-year-old truck driver for a local store, a man in the gang named The Eye, due to him having a glass eye, also a man named Lefty, and a man named Ace. All of these men checked out though completely. The public was adamant when it came to believing that one of the gang members had to have had something to do with this young girl's murder. This case was ran in nearly every Baltimore newspaper at the time, and locals couldn't get enough of every awful and perplexing detail. One of those details being one that Carolyn's own mother didn't even know herself until a little later in the case. It was discovered that Carolyn had actually been beat up a week before her death by a male youth. The reasoning for this beating was said to be due to her testimony in a stolen car case. It was believed that she didn't tell many people what happened out of fear of being viewed as a snitch, and ultimately receiving a harsher punishment by one of the men in the gang that she hung around with. After discovering this, Carolyn's mother wholeheartedly started believing it was one of the Drapes who killed her daughter. We already know that's basically what Carolyn's father thought. Now her mother was believing it as well. The Drapes were a tough crowd, described by a newspaper as a group of youths who let their hair grow at the temples to meet in ducktails at the back of the head and wear loose-fitting coats and tight-fitting trousers. Well, as time went on, more and more of these Drapes were being questioned and determined by authorities as having no involvement in Carolyn's murder. Police started diving into Carolyn's life and things that happened recently in it, and one thing stuck out to them immediately. About a month before Carolyn was murdered, she had actually testified in court. She testified for a friend who had been sexually assaulted by a man. This man was brought in for questioning to see if he had anything to do with Carolyn's case, and police though came to the conclusion that he did not. It is suspicious that this sexual assault case that she testified in took place a month before she was murdered, but apparently, according to authorities, the two had no relation at all. The next person I'm going to talk about is, in my opinion, and most other people's, a very solid person to look at when it comes to this case. This was a 45-year-old man named Ralph Garrett. A lot of sources online claim that Ralph Garrett is the man who Carolyn helped her friend testify against the month before, but they're two separate people. Ralph Garrett was a local mechanic who lived right near the murder site and not far from Carolyn's home. On that Monday that Carolyn went missing and was later murdered, Ralph dropped his wife Elsie off at work early that morning, and she would report him missing Tuesday after not knowing where he was for over a day. He was described by neighbors as being a steady and decent guy. Due to Ralph Garrett going missing the very day that Carolyn was murdered and him living so close to where it all happened, police of course wanted to bring him in for questioning. Well, Ralph's car was found 2 days later out of town. The same day police started looking more intensely for Ralph, his body was located right across the street from where Carolyn was believed to be killed. Ralph's body was found hanging by a belt from a brake wheel on top of a gondola car. He he had committed suicide. His body was located by a car inspector somewhere between 3:30 p.m. to 3:45 p.m. that next day after his car was located. I'm going to give you all a little bit of a rundown of the area thanks to a map that was made not long after everything happened. You know me, I love maps. I just gotta show you all how close everything is because it's baffling. Here is the map. 1, near the top, is where Carolyn's body was found on Tuesday, November 9th. 2 is where Ralph was found hanging on the gondola car Thursday. 3 is where Carolyn's murder scene was. 4 is where Ralph's house was. 5 is where the Wasilewski home was. And 6 is where Ralph's car was located out of town in Arundel County. As you can tell, all very close to each other, especially Carolyn's murder site, where Ralph hung himself, and where the two of them lived. After Ralph's car was located in Arundel County Wednesday night, they questioned people in the area, and they did locate one man who said he saw Ralph in a bar in that area between 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. But I was unable to discover what night that actually was that he saw him. But it was one of the nights after Carolyn's life was taken. According to a woman they spoke to, Ralph had apparently went into the bar to buy a pack of cigarettes and get a glass of water and was said to be acting strangely. Ralph's car had a flat tire when they found it, so it was guessed that that was why he abandoned it there and possibly hitched a ride back to the area he lived in and ultimately took his life. Now, Ralph's car was a two-toned car like the car supposedly seen driving away from the bridge the night that she was murdered. But in his car, they did not locate any blood anywhere or evidence of any kind to show that violence had taken place inside of the car. Also, there had been tire tracks left behind in the vacant lot where they believed Carolyn was killed, and these tire tracks did not match the tire tracks of Ralph's car. Quite a few witnesses who had things to say about Ralph and his possible connection to Carolyn though. One witness claimed they saw Ralph speaking to Carolyn the day that she was murdered, but they could not pinpoint the exact time that this happened. Another witness claimed they had seen Ralph drive in the direction of Carolyn's house for about 3 weeks before she was murdered. Police located a man who stated that he had seen Carolyn and Ralph weeks before parked on Morel Park and another time parked together on Gable Avenue. Gable Avenue being where Carolyn's murder scene and Ralph's place of suicide was. Another witness claimed they spotted him hanging around the Belvedere Bridge, which is the bridge her body was guessed to be thrown from the night of the murder. The timeline between Carolyn leaving her home and Ralph's body being found is very hard to map out because almost every source states different things happening in different orders or being off by a day or so. I did try my hardest to map everything out, and I think I have the way everything happened for this video. We do know Carolyn left her home 6:15 p.m. Monday. Carolyn and Ralph were supposedly spotted together that day. Carolyn was killed that night. Ralph was seen at a bar in a neighboring town. His car was abandoned in this neighboring town with a flat tire. Police found his car. Then his body was located right across the street from the place she had been murdered days before. Ralph had committed suicide, but he left no suicide note behind and never made it known to anyone he would have been planning such a thing. According to his wife, though, he had been depressed recently, and she gave a reasoning for that. His wife, Elsie, stated that Ralph's mother passed away 4 years earlier, and he had always gotten very down around the anniversary of her death. Elsie did not believe her husband's suicide had anything to do with Carolyn and had never heard of Carolyn before. Carolyn's family had also never heard of her hanging around this 45-year-old man before either. It was kind of news to everyone who knew them, if the witnesses who saw them together were correct, of course. I'm sure most people who look at this case narrow their view in on Ralph Garrett, but at the end of the day, police, for some reasons unknown to the public, ruled him out as a suspect. Based on witness accounts and the locations and times of certain incidents, he was linked to her case, but they had no solid evidence to tie him to it. I still think there is more when it comes to him, but for now, we have to move on. One of my absolute favorite resources to use for my videos is newspapers.com. I combed through a lot of articles on newspapers.com having to do with this case, and there were quite a few about smaller incidents in connection, and I want to go through some of those right now. The first one I came across was an article from November 18th, 1954 by the Baltimore Sun, which, like I said, were really the main ones covering this case. This article stated that police were wanting to question a 32-year-old man known as a local drug addict who was spotted in a barber shop sitting there murmuring to himself over and over again the words, "I shouldn't have done it, I shouldn't have done it," while strangely holding a rosary. Odd. According to people who knew him, he told people that he had been having woman troubles. Apparently, he had moved from the place he lived 2 months earlier, and at the time of wanting to question him, authorities were unable to locate him anywhere. They had no idea where he was, and I am unsure if they ever were able to track this individual down for questioning. An article that was released by the Baltimore Sun on November 21st, 1954 highlights some of the calls that the Wasilewski family were receiving at the time. One of the calls came from someone who claimed their name was Sandra. These calls were always very short, and this individual claimed they were with Carolyn the night that she was killed, and this individual would also cruelly ask to speak to Carolyn, of course, just to torment her parents. Police came to the home in the hopes to answer a Sandra call, and they did, but the person hung up before they could trace the call. One caller, this was believed to be another caller, called, Carolyn's mother answered, and this person said, "You know too much, you're next." It wasn't really believed that any of these callers had any direct connection to Carolyn's case. They were prank calls, and of course disgusting ones at that. When it came to the caller who called and said, "You know too much, you're next," Carolyn's mother actually thought she recognized the voice as being one of Carolyn's friends, but this didn't really go anywhere. These calls became so bad that phone operators had to ask the name and number of any person who wanted to be transferred over to the family home. This definitely lessened the amount of calls coming in. Carolyn's mother thought, and I would think this too, that the phone company would be keeping a record of every single person that called in, but apparently they weren't. A representative for the phone company stated they had not been monitoring the calls and keeping any record of them. They had just been making sure no one who didn't know the family firsthand could call, and using that as a way to scare off prank callers. According to an article released by the Baltimore Sun on November 28th, 1954, police were dispatched the night before because a cream-colored vehicle had been abandoned. The vehicle was left unattended with its windows rolled down in the 4500 block of Shenley Road. Locals stated that the car had been left there for some time, but it had definitely been left there since the murder of Carolyn. A lot of aspects of this car were very weird. For one, this cream-colored car had a dark top, meaning it was two-toned, just like the car spotted on the bridge by the firefighter the night that Carolyn was murdered. The trunk of the car was wired shut, and I couldn't find any information about what was exactly found inside of the trunk once they got it open. But they found a hammer lying on the rear floor and a pair of pliers and a woman's compact on the back seat. The car also contained newspapers, and I mean tons of them, dating back to August of that year. But the most recent newspaper in the car came from the date of Carolyn's murder, November 8th. This newspaper was from the day that she was murdered, not the day after, so it didn't cover her murder, but it was that morning's paper. There was also a book of hot rods and a violin left in its case. The hot rod book, in my mind, kind of points to one of the drapes. Remember, they illegally raced hot rods. This car's license plate had not been registered in their system as being reported missing though. Due to an article posted on November 30th, the owner of the car was located and eventually moved the car, but nothing more was said regarding questioning of him in relation to Carolyn's case. So I'm guessing he was ruled out as having any involvement. According to an article I mentioned before regarding the prank calls, a Greenmount Avenue cleaning firm had reached out to police because a man had come in to get clothes cleaned, and apparently a pair of trousers he brought in to be cleaned had blood on them. I couldn't find any further information regarding these bloody pants, I'm guessing based on the newspaper articles I read through that they never located this man, or he came back for his pants and everything checked out. There's also some weird clues when it comes to camera film. Two things in particular. One was that the day of Carolyn being murdered, she had supposedly dropped off some film to be developed at a Washington Boulevard drugstore. Of course, her life was unfortunately taken that night and she never came to pick up the film, but someone else did. Several days after her murder, a young man came and picked up the developed film. Police denied to comment to the Baltimore Sun at the time about this film and the man coming to pick it up. And I could not find any more information regarding it. Second odd thing was a friend went to police with a photo she had of Carolyn with a man, and this friend said that she had no idea who the man in the photo was and that maybe authorities could, look into him. Now, the man in the photo had kind of the quintessential look of one of the men in the gang that she hung with. I couldn't find any information if they tracked him down, but they did question a lot of these men, so they could have. And when I heard about this picture, I was thinking, is it maybe Paul? But there was no word from any of my sources that this person in this photo was Paul. Baltimore Sun columnist Jacques Kelly stated that the case of Carolyn Wasilewski became a Baltimore legend due to the fact that it has gone unsolved for so long. It definitely has, because her case has affected so many people who grew up and are locals to the area, and still to this day, every year on the anniversary of her murder, the Baltimore Police Department received phone calls regarding her case. This case is 67 years old and is still considered an open and active one at the department. Maybe not as active as other cases, but still active. One person who was very interested in Carolyn's case, and I'm sure still is today, he's currently 76, is John Waters. He is a filmmaker, writer, actor, and artist. He is responsible for quite a few films that I'm sure many of you love. He wrote and directed Hairspray, the 1988 version. He was the producer for the 2007 one as well. And he is responsible for writing and directing another time period movie that some of you may know, and I love this film, and that's Crybaby, starring Johnny Depp. John Waters was only 8 years old when Carolyn was murdered, and it really had a huge impact on him growing up, like most in that area during that time. He never forgot the poor girl that lost her life, and he never forgot the culture surrounding the group of troubled individuals she hung around with, the Drapes. Although Carolyn's murder is never mentioned in the movie Crybaby, the movie itself is inspired by her lifestyle. The gang in the movie are literally called the Drapes, and Johnny Depp's character is the lead of the Drapes, and he falls for a good girl and kind of brings her into that entire scene. If you've never seen the movie, it's a bit of a corny comedy, but it turned into kind of a cult classic, one who many are unfamiliar with as to what inspired it. Personally, I think one of the reasons people became fascinated with Carolyn's story is the fact that she did live somewhat of a secretive life. She was young, but you could never guess what she was going to do next. She was also around a group of individuals that were deemed dangerous. One newspaper article was quoted saying, "The girl Carolyn Loretta Wasilewski, jazz-loving, boy-crazy teenager who relied on adult makeup and slang talk to appear older, was brutally beaten Monday night." Headlines were sometimes very disrespectful because of how she looked and the people she hung around. She was referred to a lot as boy crazy, even though her friend Rose stated one time that Carolyn didn't go after boys any more than the other girls did. A lot of people, even people who were very close to her while she was alive, basically believed that due to her high-risk lifestyle and disobedience that she basically asked for what she got. And I think that's horrible. She hung out with a rough crowd, but from everything I read, she wasn't a bad person. She was a young teenager with her entire life ahead of her that made some bad choices as a young teenager, someone whose brain was not even fully developed yet. A lot of newspapers, as time went on, were more focused with the Drapes than Carolyn's murder itself. I think this is one of those cases where it's a perfect example, especially due to the time period and the mindset back then. Of course, a lot of people still have that mindset, where they start victim blaming. This 14-year-old girl who hung out with a rough crowd and wore makeup didn't deserve what she got due to those things. This case is just the perfect example of victim blaming, unfortunately. I couldn't find any information when it came to any DNA evidence they might possibly have when it comes to her case, but possibly if there is DNA evidence, they may put it into the system eventually using genetic genealogy, and who knows, even all these years later, this case could be solved. That though was the case of Carolyn Wasilewski. And if you have any cases that you possibly want me to cover on my channel, make sure to send those over to gabulosiscaserequests@gmail.com. And do remember that next month is September, which means it is going to be Solved September, which means that I'm going to be covering all solved cases on my channel for the entirety of that month. With all of that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Be safe, and I will see you all in the next one.